Okay, well, good morning, everybody. It's raining. It's Monday morning, and you decided to come to us to RUSI. So this must be an important conversation that we're going to have this morning. Of course, it is an important conversation. My name's Tom Keatinge. I'm the director here at RUSI of our Center for Finance and Security. It's a program we started in 2014. Of course, when we started it, all we seemed to care about was the financing of ISIS, the financing of organized crime. It was all about non-state actors. Little did I think that 10 years later, we'd be having the kind of conversation we're going to have this morning about economic security as the forward to the national security strategy says economic security is national security. I don't think that needs repeating. But the question is, what does that mean in principle? How do we actually turn that into action? And we are delighted to welcome Byrne MP this morning, chair of the Business and Trade Committee, to talk about the new report that his committee has produced. I was just saying to Liam, you've done it very quickly. He said, "Oh, it's taken us 7 or 8 months." I said, "Yes, but you've been doing a lot of other things as well in the meantime." And I think this is an area where we need urgency. We run a European Economic Security Task Force, which tries to engage with EU member states on this topic. They will publish their doctrine on the 3rd of December, we are told. So we're in a doctrine arms race, Liam, with the European Union. But I think it is something that everybody sort of feels we need to understand and to deal with. But how do we deal with that? Is a much more challenging question. And so I hope that toward a new doctrine for economic security, we'll have all the answers. So the plan this morning is we will hear a brief presentation from Liam, who will introduce the report and the findings of the report, in particularly querying whether the regime that is developing in the UK is fit for the future, and is the UK as mobilized as many of our like-minded allies. I'm then delighted to say that we have 2 expert commentators to join us, Helen Kennett, who is from Global Counsel, and Ed Conway from Sky News. So I must say, is much taller than we've only ever spoken on Zoom before when you've been asking me tricky questions. So it's great to have you here in person at RUSI this morning. If you want to get involved, I encourage you, please use the QR code on the screen and or the code that is up there. It'll reappear once Liam has made his presentation, so don't worry if you can't note it down just yet. And as I say, we'll then have a discussion about the report amongst the 4 of us with your input that I will hopefully read on the iPad. There's no fire alarm planned this morning, and if there is, it's raining so hard that the fire will be instantly put out. But there's no fire alarm planned, but if the fire alarm does go off, we just basically leave the building the way you came in or through the fire exits here. So with that, Liam, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to RUSI this morning to talk about your new report. Very thick and weighty. By the way, I think the House of Commons might be the only client of the printing industry these days, but well done for printing such a weighty report. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say, Liam. Podium's yours.
Well, Tom, it's an enormous pleasure to be here at RUSI. We have been long admirers of your work, both RUSI's work, but also your work here. The work that you've done on economic security over what is quite a long period of time now has been something that has really kind of inspired my interest in this agenda, and just the practical policy prescriptions that you're able to supply to us down the road makes a meaningful contribution to ensuring that our country is safer and stronger. So on behalf of all of us on the committee, Tom, a big thanks to you and to the team you lead and to RUSI beyond. So we're here as the Business and Trade Committee. I'm here with some of my brilliant colleagues, John Cooper, Dan Aldrich, and Justin Matters, along with the committee team, to present to you the results of 7 months' work of a new economic subcommittee on economic security that we set up at the beginning of the year. We have taken tons of evidence. We have spoken to scores of witnesses. We have met with our interlocutors in Brussels, in the United States, and in Japan. And what we're here to do this morning is to lay before you a report as a provocation, a report for debate. And I suppose we're here to strike a note of agreement, but more importantly, to sound a warning. The note of agreement is the agreement with the Prime Minister's analysis that national security is now economic security. But the warning is stark. The warning is that our economic security regime is simply not fit for the future. Just think about what happened over the course of the summer. Around about August, we had news from Jaguar Land Rover that a cyber attack basically took down not just the firm, but its entire supply chain. Took £1.5 billion worth of state guarantee to help safeguard 120,000 jobs. About the same time, our neighbours in Holland were having to engage in a wrestling match to ensure the supply of Nexperia legacy chips, to ensure that once again, supply chains across Europe didn't grind to a halt. That happened at the same time as our ally, President Trump, was engaged in a standoff with China about Chinese proposals to restrict the export of rare earth technology. 3 shocks, 1 message. Economic security is now a daily concern for business, and it should be a daily concern for policymakers. But here's the reality. The threats that we saw over the summer, they're going to get much bigger over the course of the years to come. Now, everyone has got their own, particular analysis of the future. We in Parliament actually lack a sensible, serious, robust threat analysis. And so what the committee has sought to do in this report today is just to lay out what that baseline assessment might look like. And we hope that over the course of the years to come, Parliament may be able to act on this, improve it, and use it as the framework for holding government to account to safeguard our country's economy. When you step back and you take a look at this list and you think about how they're going to grow, Helen, who you're going to hear from shortly, gave us a particular phrase that we like a lot, which is that the threat surface of business is multiplying exponentially. And what that means is something that Kieran Martin really impressed on us. The private ownership of public risk is about to expand exponentially. And as we saw in the case of Jaguar Land Rover, sometimes the public risk that needs covering from taxpayers is an extremely big bill. The reality is that these threats, these challenges, these evolutions can only be tackled by public and private working together. And so just as we need a whole of society approach to defence, we now need a whole of society approach to economic security on which our defence rests. And right now, we simply do not have this. As we sat down and listened to friends in the United States, in Europe and in Japan, and with a brilliant piece of work that RUSI helped us put together, we were able to do the gap analysis between what UK economic security defence looked like and what the defences look like amongst our allies. The key insight is that we are basically making up economic security strategy in an ad hoc way. It now risks becoming strategy by stapler, where we do a report here, a report there, we staple them together and somehow hope that they add up to the safeguards that we now need for our country. We don't think that that is actually sufficient. And so given that we have got this exponential increase in the private ownership of public risk, given that we now need a whole of society approach that helps public and private sector gather the clarity, the certainty, the durability for long-term action working together, the argument that we present is that just as we updated a doctrine of tackling counterterrorism after 9/11, so our country now needs a new doctrine for tackling economic security too. Now, we had a lot of debate about whether there should be a rigid definition of economic security. That's an approach that many countries have taken. We don't think that that is fit for the times. But what we do think is that the government needs some principles to guide the work of its economic security approach for the future. Now, these are the kind of ideas, these are the arguments, these are the points that were put to us time and time again. They tended to fall into what we put in the report as the 6 Ds. The need to diagnose the threats, the need to develop sovereign capabilities, the need to diversify both our supply chains and our supplies of critical minerals, the need to defend not just critical national infrastructure and our cyber infrastructure, but also crucially our intellectual property too, to stop it diffusing into the hands of those who wish us harm. We need to be using our forces of deterrence much more effectively, and we need to be crucially dovetailing the approach of the government with the private sector and the UK with its allies more broadly. So to rattle through them very quickly, the diagnosis piece is pretty straightforward. The government doesn't have a cross-government tech forecasting unit at the moment. We think that there should be that capability embedded in Whitehall. We need a much greater set of ambition for the Economic Advisory Service, but crucially, we need to build on one of the most important pioneering bits of state design that we've had in the last few years, the National Cybersecurity Centre, and use that kind of approach to build a platform where public sector and private sector together can work much more easily in the future. We need to develop sovereign capabilities. The government has said this. The government has said this in the Defence Industrial Strategy. Unfortunately, it has not yet quite listed them. And frankly, until we actually define what the sovereign capabilities are that we need, it's very difficult to then earmark funds in the National Wealth Fund or indeed any other source of funding to develop the capabilities we need and which we can't trade for safely and securely in the future. That is going to require, I'm afraid, the Treasury to modernise the way that it thinks about things. If you think about the big interventions of the last few years, whether that's Jaguar Land Rover or nationalisation of British Steel, those interventions have required a ministerial direction because the managing public money framework that the Treasury uses is frankly designed for another era, which has now gone. Third, we need to diversify critical supply chains and critical minerals. The document that the government has produced over the weekend on critical minerals is a good advance. Some very ambitious targets in there, very little specificity, and crucially, very little money associated with some of the ambitions that are set out. But it is moving in the right direction. And in particular, this point about working more closely with allies is something that is really important for the future. And that is an area where we think the government is doing well. Defending critical national infrastructure, I won't dwell on too much here, but we are going to now need mandatory reporting of cyber incidents. You have to report a traffic accident. Why you don't have to report a cyber incident that's got the potential to take the country down is something that was a mystery to us. But crucially, we've got to make sure that the tax regime we've got in this country actually helps companies now invest in resilience, which they do not have today. Pool Re was a system that we invented to backstop things like terrorism insurance during the height of the IRA attacks. We need to now consider how we expand innovations like Pool Re to backstop cyber insurance markets too. And then making sure that we've got trusted providers of inward capital would actually help us accelerate inward investment from allies too. Deterring threats is something that Tom and others have been writing and arguing about for an awful long time. We're simply not convinced today that the National Crime Agency or Companies House, critical bits of our defence, has access to the right kind of personnel that they need. That is because they are paid, frankly, woefully. So making sure that the people that we ask to defend our infrastructure are actually paid a market rate, we think would be a sensible way to start. But that's got to come alongside developing things like anti-coercion instruments, as the EU is proposing, but also making sure that we are frankly doing a lot more to name and shame those involved in sanctions breaches, something which doesn't happen today. And then finally, this point about dovetailing the approaches is something really important. Ultimately, the investment that is going to need to come in safeguarding our economic security for the years to come is going to come not merely from the state, it's going to come from the private sector. But unless we have got long-term clarity, certainty, and ways of working together, then frankly, that investment is not going to flow. One of the most compelling bits of evidence we took was from Archie Norman, chairman of Marks and Spencer's, in the wake of the cyber attack on M&S, who told us that frankly, he didn't think there were the spaces where public and private sectors could work together to war game scenarios we might face in the future to help ensure that our defences are as strong as they should be. Now, the blueprint needs a backbone. So I suppose if there is a seventh D, it is about delivery. So making sure that we have got a cross-Whitehall minister who is in charge of economic security is important. Making sure that we're bringing together the assets across Whitehall into an Office of Economic Security is important. This basic question, who do you ring when something goes wrong is not a question that many people can answer today. Standing back up the National Security Council Subcommittee on Economic Security, we think would be a good idea. And we think in the circumstances, it might quite be a good idea to put the Secretary of State for Business and Trade back on the National Security Council, that individual having been taken off at the beginning of this Parliament. And then making sure that we enshrine this for the long term in an economic security bill, we think would be wise. And then transforming parliamentary oversight, we think, is absolutely vital. Article 54 of the National Security and Investment Act currently prohibits ministers from sharing information with Parliament about investment decisions at the moment. We don't think that that is a sensible thing to persist with in times like these. So we hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of a conversation with you. The committee is currently setting its priorities for next year, and we will be all ears for your ideas about the kinds of work that you think the Economic Security Subcommittee should get stuck into over the course of the next year. But Tom, I suppose to conclude, this is a call, if nothing else, to rediscover our history. It was after World War I that this country really learned and consolidated the lessons of economic warfare for new times. I think it was the Advisory Committee on Trading and Blockade that originally brought together those people across Whitehall to think about how we could manage in a new world of economic warfare for the future. They produced their first bit of doctrine, I guess you might call it, the Handbook on Economic Warfare at some point in the 1930s. And those were the foundations on which we stood, the Ministry of Economic Warfare, during World War II. We are now, if not in all-out economic warfare today, we are definitely in a world where that threat is far more real. This country has stepped up to that threat before, and it's time we did it again. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay, well, that was full-throated, Liam. Congratulations again on the report. Helen, I'm going to start with you because you were name-checked by Liam there. I think said the threat surface of private sector is expanding, if I wrote it down correctly. So can you just expand on that? And maybe you can also draw on your previous experience before Global Counsel at Rolls-Royce.
Thank you very much, Tom. So just by way of background, for 3 decades, I worked in the industrial sector before I joined Global Counsel this year. And what I could see was the fact that the sectors that I were working in were very closely associated with the world of politics and the world of national security. But actually, the way in which the globalized business that I was working in meant that some of those aspects that were good things of globalization were also maybe potentially increasing the threat surface for the company in terms of the way that supply chains work, the way that sourcing worked, the way that global trade networks worked. And what I think this report very clearly talks about is about how there's a responsibility between the private sector and the public sector. I think what it ultimately calls for is a reset in the relationship that has previously been one that has worked because we have trusted the trading partners that we've worked with and we've trusted the commercial mechanisms that we've got. Fundamentally, there's now a space for distrust. And if there's distrust, then what do you do in that situation? And that is where you need to either try to protect what you've got and to promote the goodness that you might have in the way in which you work.
So maybe just staying with you for a second on that question of relationship between the private sector and the public sector. I mean, my simple view is that you're in this day and age, you're kind of asking the private sector to do things that aren't necessarily in their DNA. They aren't necessarily of commercial decisions. They are decisions for national security. So how does one start the conversation with the private sector to nudge them in a different direction?
Well, I think that there are a number of things here. One is that the public sector and the private sector agreed that there would be a transfer of responsibility for some of these assets of national security. If we think about things like undersea cables, there's always been an understanding that that is a vulnerability to a country, but it was considered to be appropriate that that's not a state asset, it's actually a privately held asset. So there's been clearly a contract between the public sector and the private sector. And that worked well until it was the case that those private sector assets themselves might be vulnerable to attack from other third parties. So in terms of the conversation, I think that there needs to be, as there naturally is anyway, and we've got this through the CNI programme, that there's an understanding of what those assets are. I think the question now is, what is the role of the state and what is the role of the private sector to protect those assets at time of a potential warfare, as Liam set out? But I think that what's fundamentally needed is an understanding of what those assets are beyond the CNI space out into the broader economy. And that's where the supply chain piece that's in the report is absolutely critical. Understanding your supply chain in any company is going to be the number one thing that all CEOs need to know now more than ever before. And it's not just knowing it down to level 2, 3, it's knowing it all the way down to the bottom, because your supply chain is only as strong as your weakest link, as the report says. And that's absolutely the case. So understanding every single element is going to be critical. So therefore, the question is, does the government understand every single element of a supply chain? No, it won't. Obviously, the work of the supply chain centre that the government is setting up hopes to achieve part of that. But it's going to be the government and industry working together, sharing information about that, which is going to be critical. But what that is going to mean is that that's going to mean the divulgence of quite a lot of potentially sensitive information by a company about its strategy, about its commercial approach, about its sourcing and procurement policy. The question is, will the private sector be happy to go to that level of detail to be able to protect itself? And that's where I think the question of why is actually at the heart of what you're saying there, Tom. Why does the public and the private sector need to have this conversation? Government needs to explain to the private sector why it needs to have that conversation. The private sector needs to have a conversation with the government about why it needs that information. I think that there's a mismatch at the moment from both sides in terms of what this debate is about. If you were to talk to people in boardrooms about economic security, they're probably more aware of the topic now than they were maybe 18 months ago. But what does it really mean? I think if you talk to people in the government, I think that there's a greater understanding of what economic security is. There is an economic security team in DBT. There's a DG of economic security. But I think that those two areas need to come together very clearly, and there needs to be a fundamental understanding before actually anything can be achieved beyond that.
Great, thank you for that. So Ed, I'll turn to you. I mean, first perspectives from you. You, I'm sure, covered some of the dramas, Jaguar Land Rover and so on, that Liam was talking about. So what's your perspective as someone who is kind of scrutinising this landscape from Sky News?
Well, so I should say, cards on the table. I'm a journalist, so the extent to which you can listen to, believe anything I have to say, obviously that's up to you. But I suppose the reason I'm here, I suppose, is because I've spent the last few years kind of spending quite a lot of time thinking deeply about supply chains and thinking about the nature of how we get the stuff we need to make all of the economic output that we want to make in this country. And I've been surprised at the extent to which, that's quite kind of, certainly up until recently, it's been quite a fringe activity. Within economics, people don't spend a surprisingly little amount of time thinking about supply chains and how they actually function. The best analogy I can think of is it's rather kind of like the difference between a spreadsheet and a map. And a lot of the way that the economic policy is kind of constructed and kind of conceptualized, and not just in the UK but elsewhere, it's kind of about those numbers. It's about how do numbers add up to a big figure like GDP. Whereas sometimes it's quite important to think about dependence and how does this part of GDP depend on that part of GDP. So if you're taking kind of Jaguar Land Rover, on the spreadsheet, we saw there was an impact. Actually, had it not been for what happened in the car industry in that month in September, the overall economy would have expanded slightly. And as it was, it contracted. So it's the first time in kind of known history that a cyber attack caused GDP to fall. I mean, that's a kind of a staggering thing. But thinking about the extent to which it wasn't just JLR, it was this potential domino effect all the way down the supply chain that would have happened if those problems continued. That's quite instructive and quite important. And I think one of the things that I've been staggered by in the last few years is the extent of and I don't mean this just to talk about the UK specifically, I mean just across the piece around the world, our ignorance about supply chains and about how stuff gets here and about the processes we need to do to turn raw materials into the products that we use just to stay alive, let alone everything else. And when one tends to have conversations within Whitehall about this, as you know, as I have done in recent years, a lot of the time the response when I say, well, what about this thing? We need that thing. Is it a problem if we're not making it domestically anymore? And the typical pat response is, well, we can't make everything. And, you know, we are a great trading nation. And if we can't, you know, if we can't make it ourselves, whether it's chemicals or whether it's cars or whether it's batteries or whatever else it might be, then we'll just import it. And I think the interesting thing, and the reason this report is important and this enterprise of thinking about economic security is important, is we are at this kind of this pivot point, I think, where for decades, really since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've been able not to think about this stuff and to kind of relegate it to you know, to oddball status. And you can just focus on GDP and trying to get it as high as possible and not think too much about whether we need to be making, you know, kind of nitrogen-based chemicals anymore. But now we're in this era where, for all sorts of reasons, I mean, partly economic security and just the threat of war is obviously right at the top of everyone's list right now. But there's other things, you know, there's net zero, there's AI, there's lots of massive industrial kind of challenges, opportunities right now, which are very resource hungry. And for those reasons, you need to be thinking about where stuff is going to come from because everyone is chasing it at the same time. And then you've got other questions like, you know, trade security. Can you actually be sure that when you're sending a shipment off to wherever it might be, that it will actually turn up? That would have been a crazy question to ask only a few years ago. But now, given what we've seen, you know, in the Red Sea, what we saw in the Suez Canal, what we've seen, you know, in the Straits of Hormuz or concerns about the Straits of Hormuz, all of a sudden the geography of trade is relevant in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. And I think you put all of that stuff together, and then, you know, it is not so crazy to be thinking at the very least, whether or not, you know, you're actually proposing to intervene in some way, just to be thinking about the map of our economy and where things come from and what we need to do to them in order to kind of to sustain our standard of living. That's not crazy. That's not fringe. That's like essential. And I think we're at the beginnings of, you know, the tanker kind of shifting around, and hopefully this is part of that. But it takes a big kind of intellectual shift to you know, to recognize that we are in a different world now to the one that we previously were in.
I mean, yes, the vulnerabilities are terrifying. I mean, if you think about all the headlines when the Suez Canal blocked and everyone was worried about, you know, Christmas being cancelled because plastic toys weren't going to come from China. But I mean, it's a very, you're right to, I think, highlight the kind of geographic element there. Liam, I want to ask you a question, which is that in your remarks and in some of the things that Ed was saying there, obviously those in the private sector that have faced economic security catastrophe through cyber attack or through supply chains being disrupted are very aware of that problem. But did you get a sense that the private sector more broadly has woken up to the challenge, absent a kind of shock, a personal shock like that?
So by and large, I would say no. So I think the cyber attack was a bit of a wake-up call. But one of the things that we worry about a lot on the committee is actually what is going on amongst SMEs. I mean, Alison Griffiths, our vice chair, is here, who, you know, made this point repeatedly about how are we going to, you know, really ensure that the cyber resilience of smaller businesses is part of this much more, this wider national strategy, because, you know, very often that information just isn't available. I mean, Helen talked about the need for bigger companies to now really understand their supply chain. I think it was Justin Madders, your question in Parliament, that really first lit up the problem that JLR tier 2s and 3s were having when JLR went down. And the reality is that JLR, they had the information about their supply chain in the systems that were hacked. And so they couldn't get that information. So because there wasn't a kind of a paper backup, for want of a better device, you know, nobody had that kind of clarity. And so I just think that these kind of shocks are predictable. But what Mark Sedwell really hammered home to us is that those big, scary lists of threats that I put up at the beginning, they're not going to happen on their own. They're going to happen together. So a cyber attack will take down a supermarket alongside a social media information campaign to encourage panic buying, together with something bad happening to subsea cables. You know, I mean, there will be things that collide, and we just, I don't think, have a place where we can actually bring together public and private to war game these scenarios and work out where the system interdependencies are and where the fault lines are. And I think, I don't think we can carry on like that, to be honest.
So I'm going to just stay with you for a second, because you kind of mentioned panic buying and that sort of thing. So where does informing the public come into this? Because I think whole of society, I think, was one of the phrases you had on or whole of system you had on the screen, because the public is. We saw it when, for example, there were problems with the supply of fuel to petrol stations. Everyone's queuing up to buy fuel, even though they didn't need to. So how do we engage with the public?
Well, I think through these war games, frankly, for want of a better phrase, and I think we're all trying to be more Finnish now as we worry about these things. There's a lot of lessons to learn from the way Finnish society has had to come together to tackle these kind of systemic threats, and we are all going to have to become a bit more Finnish, I think, in the future. And so, we smiled when we took evidence from the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster about this point, because we sort of said, look, threats come together, wargaming, and the kind of reply was, yeah, we're testing the text messaging system this weekend. And you kind of think, well, it's a bit more than testing the text messaging system. We need a bit of the state where we're able to wargame this and test it, and we've got to think about how the public is brought in the way that the Baltic states have had to do for many, many years.
So, Helen, I want to come back to you just a bit more on the private sector. So again, maybe to pick up on the question I asked Liam there, for those in the private sector who haven't yet sort of experienced the impact of economic security threats, how should we be selling to them the need to perhaps make decisions which are not necessarily in their commercial interests?
Well, this, I think, is where it comes down to what is the relationship between the public sector and the private sector when it comes to intelligence, because the way that the private sector operates is that it operates for operational commercial efficiency. It operates in the interest of its shareholders. And when it sets things like its procurement and its supply chain strategy, it's going to be done to optimize all of the other things that are important to it as a business. It's not necessarily going to be thinking about national security issues. So what it's going to need to have is that it's going to need to have intelligence from the government or from governments that help to identify where the vulnerabilities are in its supply chain that could cause some national security or also some threats to that company. And that intelligence piece is something that does happen with those companies that are very close to national security issues and interests, absolutely, that there's information sharing there. But what I think we're talking about in this report here is there being a wider range of companies that fall into that orbit. And so therefore, how does the government share the sort of intelligence that's going to be instructional to the strategy teams of those companies as they think about their procurement and their sourcing? And there are supply chains that take years to change, and that also might need some regulatory support to be able to change. And so those things actually need a very long-term bit of planning, which I think means that as we look at the relationship between the government and the private sector, the government and the private sector need to understand what can be done now in terms of some of the more sort of immediate things like cybersecurity, which is an immediate, let's just stop the door, as it were, sort of from opening, through to some of the long-term aspects. So that, I think, is what needs to be had, is a deeper conversation, which I think is one of the challenging areas around everything to do with economic security, which is that when we've got globalized supply chains, and when we've got those decisions that have been taken with contracts that might be 5-10 years out, how do you convince a company that it's going to do something different? What is the cost of that? And without spoiling Liam's 6 or now 7 Ds, because you added delivery, I do think that there's maybe another one, which is decide, which is the Treasury and the government need to decide, what is the cost of this? Who's going to bear the cost of it? Will it be the private sector? Well, that's going to be difficult to instruct a company, especially a globalized company, to absorb a cost. Is it going to be the Treasury that absorbs a cost? This is more than business continuity. This is actually whether the economy can thrive and function. So I think that there's a decide piece here, which is what is that cost of our society continuing to basically survive and thrive? That is going to be the conversation that I think is going to be very difficult for governments to have with the private sector. And if I can just put a bit of context on this one, at the point at which the economy is going through some challenging times, at the point at which the department responsible for economic security is going through massive cuts. This is also a topic that is going to be quite a messy bit of policy. It can't be done in meetings where you have a whole sector sitting together or a group of businesses, because this is going to be about individual company supply chains and strategies. That's not going to be shared with other people. It's going to require a series of very intense deep dives into every single one of those companies that the government decides is important to understand it, and then very deep conversations about their willingness or otherwise, might be incentivized, that might be a cost, to do something different. That is going to be very different. So I think that either the government goes about it in that very clear owned way, or what will happen is this will happen to companies, or it will happen because of geopolitics, or it will happen because of their peer group elsewhere in another country doing it, because of other governments doing it. There is a sense of inevitability about all of this. Either people choose to take control of it, or it will happen. The end game will still be the same.
So be a leader, not a follower. Determine your own destination. Another D there. But actually, I was going to throw yet another D on the table, because I mentioned our Economic Security Task Force, and Denmark are currently chair of the EU presidency. And it's interesting, in conversations that we had up there in the summer was, and I wonder whether anyone in the government is doing this, is literally going through every single industry and saying, okay, we've already got that one because they are, as you say, close to national security. But the perimeter has expanded. So actually companies that felt that they could act independently with no concern for national security, maybe not anymore. We need to nudge them. And then there'll be some that we don't worry about. But actually the going through almost kind of industry code by industry code and saying which ones are a matter of national security today in the environment we're in, I think is a job for somebody to do. Now, we're in the week of the budget, Ed, so I'm going to come to you, and it nudges a bit on what you were saying, Helen. How do we, I mean, again, this isn't a particular comment about this government. Governments always want to do things on the cheap and spend as little money as possible. But what we can see here is that without investment, we are going to find that there are costs down the road which we're going to wish we had fixed today. So how does one sell the idea of investing in economic security to the government and make the dreaded value for money argument?
I think that's the fulcrum of this. I think it's very hard. I mean, you can make a case that there are certain types of things where, if we were making them here, then we'd be creating jobs. And definitely we have kind of deindustrialized as a nation faster than basically any other country in the developed world. And so you can make the case that there's a lot of good jobs that could come back if we were making more things here. But ultimately, it's a question of price. We have traded security for being able to buy cheap stuff. We can buy cheap stuff now. And, a really good example of this, maybe not so much security, but, a good example is we are, I think, the only major country in the G7 that doesn't have tariffs on Chinese EVs, special extra tariffs on Chinese EVs. In America, they're over 100%. In Europe, they're not as high as that. They're pretty high. Japan doesn't have them, but Japan doesn't tend to buy many in the way of Chinese cars for all sorts of reasons. So that's a decision. We get cheaper cars, much cheaper cars. We stand a hope of hitting that 2030 target. But in the meantime, we are very dependent on China for cars, and we will be if we're going to hit that target, certainly for cheap cars. And I think, to me, that shows a kind of form of revealed preference in the government. In the absence of any specific, as Liam was saying, any specific form of strategy, in the absence of a ministry that's focusing on this, we kind of have to go on decisions that are made. And thus far, revealed preferences, we tend just to prefer cheap stuff. But the thing is that rare earths are pretty cheap right now. They're actually pretty cheap. Tungsten is pretty cheap because China has such a dominance over this market and is able to refine these metals, refine tungsten far cheaper than anyone else. And there's question marks over the degree to which there's kind of subsidies there. So, I mean, all of this kind of blends not just into economic security, but into industrial strategy as well. And I think that's where this gets both messy, but also maybe kind of interesting, because we have some industrial strategy goals, and the difference between industrial strategy, economic security, energy security, there's a Venn diagram there, and this kind of fits into the middle of it. But it's certainly the case that there is, for instance, a tungsten mine in Devon. It's the world's second biggest tungsten resource. They're kind of ready to start mining there. But right now, it's just impossible for them to mine because it's just impossible to compete with China because Chinese prices are so low at the moment. And I think just to take that as an example, because it's quite useful, really one of the only ways that the government is going to kind of get Britain self-sufficient in tungsten, which, by the way, you need tungsten, as many people here will know, if you're kind of building munitions and bullets and things like that, because tungsten's very hard. It's an important kind of alloy. The only way of getting that up and running is basically putting quite a lot of money down on the table and committing to something like a price floor or stockpiling or various policies that none of which appear in the critical mineral strategy, which was published over the weekend. And so I think that's the difficulty is at some point, this is budget week, at some point you have to spend some money. And at some point you also have to reckon with the fact that there is a trade-off here, security on the one hand and price on the other. And at the moment, you could reasonably make the case that Britain has perhaps more than any other country in the world lent towards having cheaper prices, EVs being that perfect example of that. And if we're going to push in the other direction, it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be tough for the Treasury to reckon with that because that means having to kind of admit to making things more expensive. Only a final thing I'd say, though, on this, one kind of interesting other kind of counter example is, again, over the weekend, one of the many budget pre-briefings that we got is that, and in this case, it's actually an official announcement rather than just a bit of leaking. There is a difference, it turns out, is that we're going to be ending the de minimis or low value imports rule, which basically says that when you're sending stuff into the country, if it's under £135, you don't have to pay tariffs on it. That is an example where the government is taking a decision that will make things more expensive for people, which is interesting, isn't it? Because actually it's one of the few examples of that I can think of in recent years, albeit that it's basically following in the footsteps of the EU and the US who have also done it. But it's exactly that, Tom. It's this balancing between we like cheap stuff, and if we want to either make stuff here or kind of secure the supply, it may end up being more expensive and actually confronting that.
I haven't heard such a passionate exposition on tungsten since my chemistry teacher at school, but actually thinking about it, it's a defense and security product, as you
the mine was only up and running in the wars. So I think in the First World War and the Second World War is the only time it's actually because of its importance for this stuff.
Well, let's hope that it's not needed for that reason any time soon. Liam, I wanted to just ask you a question, which is, of course, governments always want to kind of attract investment and so on. So did you think at all about the importance of economic security for kind of inward investment, the kind of inward investment that we want? It's a question, by the way. Do keep asking your questions via the QR code.
Yeah, we did. I mean, the point about dovetailing is the UK has got to dovetail its a global approach with our allies, and we have done a terrific job actually over the last year of getting new free trade agreements in place. We're not just championing free trade; we're defending them. If you think about AUKUS, GCAP Tempest, Operation Shader, Euro NATO, we have defence alliances that sit on top of those free trade agreements that are really important. And we say that we've now got to add a third dimension to those relationships, which is economic security. And so the kind of ideas that we're talking about with South Korea, for example, will help make sure that there's a proper economic security partnership there in the future. And we've got to now extend that into potentially joint investing, particularly into processing critical minerals, because it is going to take several allies working together to make sure that de-risking job is done. So making sure that this is a kind of a cornerstone of what we do in our international global network of alliances, whether you want to call that building a kind of economic NATO or an alliance of free trading democracies, whatever you call it.
NATO, wasn't that a Liz Truss shout?
Well, I think that's where the phrase may have started, which is why...
I mean, I have to say I did agree with it at the time, but it wasn't a popular position.
We used the phrase alliance of free trading democracies in the report, but ultimately this has got to become part and parcel of what we do amongst those free trading allies that we are connecting together in some pretty extraordinary free trade alliances right now.
Yeah. You want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to comment on what Liam was saying. I absolutely agree that there needs to be a way of pulling together the allies on this topic, but I think that we need to make sure that the baseline for that is something that works for UK industry, that actually, as we look at economic security, I think often the debate is framed in a very defensive way, which is how do we protect the things we've got? How do we make sure that we as a nation have got what we've got? Now, if everybody does that, then you then end up with a series of siloed economies. Actually, if you've got a good manufacturing base or good mineral processing or whatever it might be here, it could be an offensive opportunity. So actually there's a defensive piece in terms of making sure that we've got everything that we need for the economy that we want. But actually, how do we trade some of those positions in an offensive way to others? See this actually as a growth opportunity, not just as sort of a hunkering down piece. So that's one thing. So I think that looking at the commercial basis of this, as you go into those economic security deals, that means that you might have something that you can positively trade, as is the case with other countries that have critical minerals and where that's appeared in those documents. And then looking at things like investment screening. If you're a global company headquartered in the UK, you're on the FTSE, and you're working with X number of investment screening regimes, how could you use those alliances to try to make those businesses do their operations in different countries in a slightly easier way? Now, that's not to remove any of the requirements, but actually, rather than them going through multiple investment screening processes, if they look broadly the same, it could mean that they could get to a better commercial result sooner. That could then strengthen the company in the UK. It could mean that they are therefore stronger in case of any other global potential acquirers. So it feels like there's a sort of an undercurrent of commercial strategy that we could put under some of these economic security clauses in the bilats and in the FTAs. And it's been quite clear if you look at what the US has been doing and all of their deals that they've struck over the last X number of months. There's been a flurry in the last couple of weeks. Almost every single one of them has an economic security piece to it, because they see it as a very important source of soft power, but also of domestic economic reach out into those countries.
So you've actually read my mind, because I wanted to talk towards the end about, I think you said offensive approaches, but as not hunkering down and just thinking, gosh, we've got to muddle through or somehow protect ourselves. So maybe Liam, a question to you: were there any examples from the? I'm going to ask you about Eliza's work now. Were there any examples from the international comparisons that were done where you thought, you know what, those guys have got it right? They're not just securing their supply chains and so on, but they're also using this as a moment to be offensive, to push out into the world.
I mean, members of the committee will have different views. I mean, I think the country that impressed me most was Japan. I mean, they just have spent so many years having to think this through for neighbourhood reasons. And they were just a really good example of where there isn't just an opportunity, say, for Japan to, improve its exports. There's actually new opportunities for Japan and the UK to improve their exports together into, say, CPTPP markets. So, we've now got allies inside free trade agreements where there is a strong defence bridge taking shape, and where there is now an opportunity for us to be co-developing economic security assets, which are then of benefit to a much larger number of smaller countries. And so I think we're only at the very beginning to think that through, but the potential is extraordinary, especially in cyber security and related sectors.
So Ed, maybe sort of same question to you. Do you have any sense of like who's doing this really well? You can't say Japan because Liam's taken that one already. But who's doing that really well?
That's a good answer.
Are there friends on the other side of the?
Well, I mean, China's the obvious example. China's been kind of thinking about the architecture of supply chains and thinking about how to kind of to build industries for a long time. And but I do think no one is doing it brilliantly. Maybe even not China, just because these are muscles that we haven't really had to use for decades and decades, and now we're starting to kind of relearn how to use them. And the irony is, I mean, Liam, you were talking about, it was an enormous shock in World War I when Britain, this great laissez-faire nation, suddenly had to discover how to, we had to create a kind of Ministry of Munitions and Ministry for the Blockade and Ministry of Economic War, and go against all of our instincts, because our instincts are, to be quite laissez-faire, I think, as a nation. We're having to, as a kind of global community, to do that all over again this time around. But the difference this time is the nature of integrated supply chains is far, far more complex than it was back then. You didn't really have integrated kind of global supply chains as tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers in the way that you do now. So just the nature of what we're having to grapple with is entirely on a different order. And so of all the places that have tried, have looked at it, China has kind of done the best job. But I see this kind of as there's an opportunity here. In the absence of anyone else doing much on this, there surely are opportunities to be nations and indeed institutions which are spending a lot of time trying to map out how does a supply chain work. I mean, again, when I wrote Material World, one of the things I tried to do is to tell the story of how a silicon chip is made from mine through to the final kind of transistor, so you could understand the different steps it went through. And the thing that was shocking about this was that I was kind of one of the first people to do this in a book. And, really, if we're going to try and understand, as Helen was referring to, if we're going to try and understand these supply chains, then we need both the companies involved, because a lot of the times, the companies that we all see at the surface, the OEMs, the car producers, they may understand the next tier down in their supply chain, but they may not understand the tier 3, they may not understand the tier 4. And so it's going to be an enormous exercise to try to understand that, both for them and, as you were saying, Helen, both for them and for government. And it's not clear where that's going to be funded, but I would have thought there are opportunities there, given it's going to improve our understanding and perhaps could lead to more, sophisticated supply chain relationships. But my guess is it's going to be a net cost. I mean, all of this. And it's that's ultimately is the difficulty. It's hard to see how you can do this and in net terms it not be a cost, because golly, I mean, the last 20 years of disinflation that we've benefited from thanks to globalization, to some extent, we're thinking about somewhat reversing that or beginning to, and that is going to be really tough, I think, economically.
So I'm mindful of the time, but there's a question here, which is going back to Ed, something you were saying earlier on. So obviously, governments are desperate for economic growth. But is there a risk in kind of pursuing economic security, we actually blunt the opportunity for growth? Or is your argument that actually, for example, in the Jaguar Land Rover example you gave, there was no economic growth because of a failure of economic security?
I mean, I think there is a risk of it diminishing growth somewhat, because it's a less efficient way of what we have right now. So I went to this factory in Birmingham where they make little metal parts. They're called Brandau, and they were making a part that goes into the rearview mirror of a car, and it's a little tiny electrode. They send it off to China, and then it goes into the rearview mirror and it gets sent back. This single factory, it turned out, was making 55% of the global supply. 55% of the global supply of this little thing. This is one tiny example of the extent to which we've concentrated economic activity in single places, often for benign reasons. And the point is, we tend only to find out when something goes wrong, when there's, I don't know, Fukushima is the great example within the economic literature. Something, some terrible disaster happens, factories get shut down, suddenly you realize, oh, hang on, literally the global supply of a particular type of paint was made in this factory, so you can't make the cars with that color anymore. That is just the way we've arranged the world. I think changing that will just be expensive. And I mean, there might be kind of individual growth opportunities, but I can't see how it's kind of net positive. But by the same token, look at the UK right now. We are deindustrializing at a speed. So I mentioned we deindustrialize faster than anyone else. If you, like I do, kind of go around the country and speak to people within the chemical sector, plant after plant is shutting down right now. And we're not making our own chemical nitrogen anymore. We're not making our own sulfuric acid anymore. These two things, we've been making them for like 100 years. We're not making them anymore. What's an important thing that you make out of those two things? It's explosives. So for all that BAE is saying it wants to make its own explosives, the main precursor chemicals for those explosives, we don't make them anymore. And that stopped in the last kind of 12 or 18 months. So whether or not that's kind of like a growth positive story, it's pretty essential when it comes to the supply chain.
But I think we also have to think now about risk-weighted growth, right? So in any business projecting its revenues out to the future will have a kind of a discount factor on there for risk. We don't take that approach to national accounting, and we've just got to start rethinking the way we kind of calculate future growth to take into account the risks that we're running by taking some kind of investment decisions and not taking others.
Discounted cash flows, Liam, a horrible nightmare back to my time as an investment bank. Thank you for that. You wanted to come back in, Helen?
Yes, I just wanted to on the supply chain piece that Ed was just talking about in terms of the criticality of things that you don't know that they're critical until you see them, which is in some ways a little bit like a definition of economic security, which is that it's quite hard to define. And I agree that you haven't tried to define it, otherwise it would be too tight. But actually, you know it when you see it. And one of the things that sprang to mind as I was reading the report over the weekend was thinking back to the CO2 crisis, when CO2 in food packaging in 2021 was suddenly a big issue. Now, that wouldn't be probably in one of the IS8 sectors. It wouldn't be seen to be a sovereign capability, but it was a national concern and it required some government intervention.
Yeah.
And there was a problem. So actually, understanding supply chains generally, that would be a massive mapping piece, but actually there are vulnerable areas elsewhere, and sort of at your peril you try to draw it too tightly.
Yeah.
So the hour has come to a conclusion far too quickly. Liam, I'm going to give you the last word, which is what are we as a community meant to be doing to help obviously amplify your report, but help your committee? What needs to happen next?
So thank you. So tell us what you think, tell us what we got wrong, and tell us what to do next. So, this is my sort of slightly hidden agenda here, Tom. So we are
That's why I asked you the question.
slowly but surely to change the way that Parliament works and certainly the way that select committees work. And so the way, for example, that our committee figures out its work plan for the year ahead is we don't just sit in a committee room in Westminster coming up with pet projects of our own. We have been out on the road talking to businesses around the country for a week up and down the country. We just had our big business summit in Parliament last week. We have lots of MPs out with toolkits doing consultations in their constituencies. And we kind of put all of that information back together. And it's from that input that we then figure out our programme of inquiries for the years ahead. We've got to come to a decision over the next month about the kind of inquiries that we should now run for the Economic Security Subcommittee over the course of 2026. And so we would love people's views on the kinds of things that that now need more of a committee deep dive over the course of next year.
Great. Well, look, a call to action to end on. Thank you all very much, Liam Byrne, Ed Conway and Helen Kennett, for joining us this morning. And congratulations to you and your committee and your hard-working staff, by the way, for the production of this report. So thank you again.